On paper, Hereditary and Midsommar, released 1 year apart, sound like nearly identical movies. A family tragedy leaves a few characters caught in the middle of a violent pagan ritual in which, rather than defying, they succumb, one character becoming a sort of supreme leader who's crowned and worshipped. There are lots of similarities in the visuals of these movies. Lots of naked bodies gathered around in worship, people being burned alive, bashed in faces. The triangular barn, framed symmetrically as it is, seems to recall the treehouse from Hereditary. Even the brutal scream crying carries over as the main character learns about the family tragedy and reacts to it all off-screen. But despite these similarities, Midsommar is a completely different experience. Hereditary is a very tight movie, constantly speeding narrowly forward until the end, whereas this film is a loose, psychedelic experience. It's hard to even classify this as a horror movie. There's been a lot of sentiment about horror movies recently that Hereditary was a part of, regarding the fact that when a horror movie is about more than cheap scares, it's often classified as a different genre, something like dramatic thriller or something else like that, thus damning the term horror. Obviously, I don't think horror deserves that connotation, and despite the media's reluctance to call a lot of good horror movies, I think the term is starting to gain more appreciation for its recent indie and art house entries, and eventually it won't be seen as a derogatory genre to classify a movie as. That whole situation has nothing to do with my reluctance to call Midsommar a horror movie. That's a pretty arbitrary thing. So is my reasoning, but my reasoning is more due to the fact that even though there is a persistent dread, like with a lot of A24 horror movies, and some really disturbing stuff here and there, I feel like more so than with other movies, the horror elements are kind of kept on the back burner in this film and provide something more transcendental than scary or creepy. The whole thing feels like a bad trip, which is clearly the point of the movie, and it's wildly successful in that. And I suppose you can classify it however you want, but it feels like a different kind of dread to me. I'd say the closest movie genre-wise I can think of is Climax. Anyway, the visuals are incredible, some of the best I've seen all year, aside from the questionable choice of Century Gothic as the subtitle font. The film plays with distortion a lot, sometimes being subtler than other times, but I appreciate that it is varying levels of subtlety. Sometimes it's just slightly distorted bokeh or dilated pupils, sometimes entire faces are distorted, eye dimensions and mouth length and stuff like that. The area the festival takes place in has a bunch of standout structures and buildings that we get a sizable amount of time to look at through a fair share of symmetrical, satisfying shots that I'm sure I'll be seeing frequently on Twitter in the near future. But what particularly stands out about this movie is how bright it is. Between the constantly cloudless sky, the bright shades of green in the grass, and the light dirt, and the white traditional outfits, this movie is almost blinding, and constantly just walks the line of being overexposed, but it's all very carefully calculated. On one hand, it's impressive that the film is disturbing in spite of its brightness, but on the other hand, I do think the disturbingness owes a lot to the juxtaposition of the subject matter and the visuals. Like his thesis film The Strange Thing About the Johnsons, and some parts of Hereditary, even though that movie leans more toward a macabre aesthetic, the brightness is loaded with irony to oppose the dark subject matter, and the result is this really effectively disturbing and specific uncanniness. I'm not sure how much of this is Aster himself and how much of it carries over to other films Paweł Pogorzelski has shot. I've only seen his work with Aster, but it's nothing short of impressive. I will say that there are a few shots earlier in the movie where you can kind of feel Aster and Pogorzelski kind of smugly thinking to themselves, look how cool this is, without the flashy composition really adding any more meaning to the scene other than just looking cool. I'm not sure how much of a bad thing that is though, because the last thing you want is a forgettable shot. The worst I can say is that it was a little distracting. As for the music, Bobby Krlic did a great job blending a few different genres. We have a recorder trio that pops up, as well as chants, and even some more orchestral sounding stuff. He plays a lot with dissonance, minor seconds frequently popping up. The sound design, like Hereditary, is full of particularly loud Foley that makes every small movement within each scene more visceral and impactful. You can tell when people actually care about making each minute movement pop. And the editing is just as focused as Hereditary, with a lot of similar match cuts that transition to a different time of day. If I had to describe Ari Aster's style, I would call it unflinching. Everything about it, from the way he has his actors talk to each other, to the brutally clear and intelligible violence and gore, even stuff like the way he has nudity framed or characters scream, isn't necessarily in your face, but it leaves everything out in the open for you to consume it all as it is, not trying to trick you into thinking it's scarier than it is by framing and editing it all sorts of wacky ways or hiding or manipulating anything like that. It's a little hard to articulate, but when you know what to look for, it's blatantly clear. This has had its consequences, though. His dialogue often has colloquialisms that result from human error that he's translated to his own scripts, but don't usually make it into competent movie dialogue, and sometimes it's a little comical because we're just not used to movie characters speaking like that. But it does add an appreciated realism that I believe goes together with the bluntness of everything else. Even more so is his approach to the specific scares. Both times I saw Hereditary in theaters, people started laughing towards the end. Some of it was nervous laughter from people who didn't know how else to react to being scared, but some of it was because some of it looks a little silly if you're not 100% buying into it. That's probably even more so the case with this film, sort of all or nothing, and if you choose to buy into it, it pays off, but it can be understandably difficult to buy into, which leaves some moments of horror a little hard to take seriously. I think this is inherent to Astor's approach, and I honestly think it's a refreshing voice, even if it does come with those consequences. I'm usually not bothered by that sort of thing. The timing of this movie is pretty great because I've been watching a lot of breakup movies in the past month for something I'm writing, and I love how Astor uses regular human drama as the foundations of his horror films, in a very specific way. He's obviously not the only person who does that, but I appreciate that he does. So this helped me figure out what exactly it is that I'm writing. The script does a really good job conveying a relationship where, even though it's definitely one-sided and the guy's being kind of a dick, it's not one of those where he's just a horrible person and it doesn't even make sense for her to still be with him. He shows signs of real affection here and there, signs that he's trying, even though he has his reservations about the relationship and is kind of figuring out an escape plan, but he doesn't totally want out and he's sort of torn between and kind of suffering from that, which I think is a really realistic take on breakups that most movies exaggerate in either direction. If you ask me, Will Poulter's character Marc was a bit of a caricature. People like him exist, most of the humor in the film comes from him being a sort of everyman, and he also serves to accentuate the worse aspects of Christian's personality. But something about him was a little too irredeemable, and I'm not sure whether it was the script or the casting choice. Poulter does bring a lot of humor to the film and is successfully aggravating. I'm a fan of his as an actor, but I couldn't help but feel like he was a little over the top, whereas Christian was a bad person in far more humanistic ways, which made my feelings towards him feel a little more genuine and complex, and the same even goes for Josh to an extent, at least more so than Marc. And I should mention that aside from Poulter being questionable, all the performances in this movie are terrific, especially Florence Pugh. Her performance will inevitably be compared to Toni Collette's last year, but they both do an incredible job dealing with trauma in dramatic and realistic ways. Christian doesn't exactly strike one as a difficult character to play because there are unfortunately so many people like him, but Jack Reynor does a good job making him feel human. I love William Jackson Harper. He's just so fun in everything he's in, even if he and Poulter are mostly in the background in this movie. And Wilhelm Blomgren as Pelle is unsettling from the start, in the same way the rest of the movie is, so he sort of serves as a warning of what's to come, and he somehow only becomes more unsettling once he starts to fit in with the people from Helsingland. Collectively, between the costumes and the performances, the film does such a great job portraying this group in the same vein that tourists go and bastardize the places they're touring. Marc, for instance, is the blatantly disrespectful guy who embodies all the American stereotypes, pissing where he wants and looking to fuck whomever he can. Josh has respect for the culture, but in a way that sort of exoticizes it and thus becomes disrespectful, which is a kind of person I know I'm familiar with. And I'd say Simon and Connie represent people that don't understand other cultures, even though they see some barbaric shit in this movie. Those four are the clearest in terms of recognizable archetypes, and I think that's because they're the simplest characters. Pelle's role is also clear, but because Danny and Christian are a little more complex characters, this symbolism doesn't really apply to them as much. That's why I don't feel it's contradictory to the idea of the unwelcome tourist that the cult embraces Danny as their May Queen, as is illustrated by the costume change, and Christian's role is also illustrated by his costume change into a white robe, but he's not exactly accepted in the same way Danny is, as you know, because you've seen the movie, right? That has more to do with the relationship aspect of the film, and that's also where my gripes start to show a little more. This film is biting off a lot, and it has the runtime to do so, clocking in at 2 hours and 20 minutes. Like I said, it's a lot looser than Hereditary, which is mostly refreshing, but it is questionable at some moments in terms of pace. I found it a little odd that there was a sequence where they take shrooms in this area the day before walking to the village. I didn't really understand why that had to play out that way, why it had to be a separate place. It kind of felt like we're here and now we're going here. I don't know. But more importantly, I feel like the thematic ideas it's tackling don't really come together in the most coherent way. Danny's family trauma adds context to the relationship in that she feels like she has too much baggage and feels sort of isolated and alone. And it also serves as the reason for Christian inviting her to the trip in the first place. The film's opening was really effective and hooking, but something as traumatizing as murder-suicide carries a lot of weight that isn't really explored as much as what the film is more interested in. Maybe if the film sacrificed the thesis rivalry subplot, which especially felt disconnected and irrelevant to everything else that was happening, then it could have further explored her trauma, because by the end of the movie, the topic feels more or less completely dropped. But I feel like enough ground is covered even in Hereditary that Midsommar would run the risk of treading the same steps. I can't really think of a great solution because I do think that everything that happened could have happened both without the murder-suicide and without the rivalry between Josh and Christian, so that was a little messy. Even something like a lesser trauma than murder-suicide, or I feel like the means by which she becomes isolated are a little too brutal to be relatable, and I also think it leads to less contrast between the normal world that the movie starts in and the one it eventually goes to. I do think the film is trying to say at the end that she's found a new family here, just like Pele explained to her that after he lost his parents, he found family here, thus tying together that whole thread. But because that theme seems completely absent from the latter half or latter third of the movie, you don't really get that sense in the conclusion, at least not as strongly as the breakup. That said, the more I think about it, the more I do feel the connection between the two, even if I feel like the breakup idea is executed a lot better. The thesis rivalry subplot, on the other hand, I think it would take a lot of mental gymnastics for me to tie that coherently to the rest of the film's themes, other than illustrating how Christian is a piece of shit. Some food for thought at the end, that's what I'll call it because I don't quite think it's a criticism, is the fact that back in Hereditary, Aster set up this tension between agency and no agency as a narrative and thematic choice. The scene in that movie was brilliant because the class consensus was that it's more tragic when the characters have a choice because the bad things that happen are their own doing instead of a sick puppet show, but then the movie becomes a sick puppet show and is all the more disturbing for it. Midsommar deals with puppetry as well, controlled by drugs and pagan authorities rather than demons and spirits. It's hard to tell, though, if this plot was fixed from the start, because everyone who dies in this movie who doesn't sacrifice himself dies as a result of breaking some sort of rules. Mark pisses on the ancestral tree, Josh takes illegal photos of the scripture, Connie and Simon call the ritual sick and try to leave, and Christian is chosen as a sacrifice by Danny, though before he was snooping around, and had also already performed his duty of impregnation that he was basically his sole purpose. There is this line at the beginning that suggests that the events were predestined to some degree. What I really loved was that throughout most of the film, Danny doesn't really have agency. She's just letting things happen, even in her own relationship, and at the very end she gets a critical choice. There was no critical choice in Hereditary, and that made it subversive, but the critical choice in this film punctuates everything it's trying to say about relationships and breakups, and I guess even family to a lesser extent. And choosing Christian as a sacrifice to be burned alive is such a visually stirring way to illustrate their breakup. What I don't quite know how to feel about is the fact that Christian doesn't totally have a critical choice. If he were sober and then impregnated Maya, that would be a clear choice, but because he was drugged, it feels a little less like he was the one who took the last step that put the nail in the coffin of their relationship, which could potentially water down the human aspect of their breakup and what led Danny to end things. He does take the drug knowing it leads to heightened suggestibility, even if he initially tried to refuse it. But assuming it wasn't his choice, one way to interpret the situation is that the people of Helsingland, which we've sort of now established as Danny's new family, are the ones who perform the final push that leads her to end their relationship. And that could be representative of the input family has on a toxic relationship and how they help or hurt their family members, even if it's this fucked up family dynamic. I think that would be a nice way to connect those themes a little more and make the family trauma stuff feel a little more necessary, so I'm gonna stick with that interpretation. My smaller gripes have more to do with Josh and Marc's deaths. It kind of felt like Aster at one point arbitrarily decided, you know what, I think it's time to kill these guys off. It kind of helps in terms of pacing in some regards, but the narrative doesn't totally justify that they had to happen when they happened, especially with Marc. At one point, the girl he keeps looking at just pulls him aside and that's it. But Josh was even more frustrating because even though the film did a good job establishing how invested in this thesis he was, breaking into that room and taking pictures of the scripture after being direly told not to just feels way too dumb person walks into spooky house and dies. And I think Aster is better than that. I don't totally understand why the person that killed Josh was wearing Marc's face all Texas Chainsaw Massacre like, but I'm not gonna get too hung up on that. I can dig it. I guess Aster probably wanted them both gone before the last day in the film, but because the last day takes up so much runtime, it does feel like the deaths happen a little early. But we'll see if my opinions change on that. There's a moment early in the movie where Marc says, "Hey Christian, can you look at this paragraph for me?" All suspiciously, and they go into another room. And then Danny starts talking to Pele, but I assumed we would eventually see some, like, secretive conversation between Marc and Christian because that's what Marc's intonation implied. But that never happened, so I'm wondering if there was a deleted scene and they were unfortunately stuck with that transition to it or what. But at that point, I'm getting kind of nitpicky. That was just something I noticed that I wanted to mention. Didn't really have an effect on my enjoyment of the film. Because the two movies inevitably have to be compared, I will say Hereditary is my preferred film between the two. There's a lot that's nearly identical about the films, a lot that's incomparable, but there are aspects of Midsommar's execution that I think are kind of messy, as I've just explained, whereas I still think pretty much everything about Hereditary is perfect. That said, Midsommar is still one of the most creative and gorgeous movies to come out all year. Still engrossing and dreadful and effective, with the most disturbing and hilarious sex scene in years, with much more provocative imagery that doesn't feel like it's just provocative for the sake of being provocative. And it still manages to tackle relevant themes under the rhetoric of horror. So far it's sitting very well with me. I'm liking it more and more the more I think about it, and I honestly can't wait to go back to the theater and rewatch it. I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. Let me know what you think. This one seems to be a little more polarizing than Hereditary, which is understandable. Like and comment and share and subscribe, because apparently telling you to do those things makes you more likely to do them. Have a nice day, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.